It began not with a headline or a scandal, not even a whisper behind closed palace doors. It began with silence. A silence so heavy, it echoed louder than any royal fanfare. One winter morning, Prince Andrew, once a boy cradled in the arms of Queen Elizabeth II, the favorite son, the decorated naval officer, the Duke of York, found himself staring at the four walls of a home that no longer wanted him. Not because of political tides or public inconvenience, but because of something deeper, darker, and irreversible: disgrace. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. He walked the halls of Royal Lodge as a ghost in his own story. Not a single royal flag fluttered overhead. No butlers moved swiftly through the corridors. The staff, reduced and wary, spoke in hushed tones. And yet Andrew, ever proud, still moved as if the walls remembered who he once was. But they didn't, because neither did the people. To the British public, the world, and most devastatingly, to the monarchy itself, he was no longer a prince. He was a liability. And for the House of Windsor, that was an unforgivable sin. What could cause such a catastrophic fall from grace? How did a man born second in line to the British throne end up alone, abandoned, and reportedly evicted from the very estate he believed would be his sanctuary for life? This story is not about a scandal alone. It's about the systematic dismantling of a royal identity. It's about betrayal, silence, whispered ultimatums, and ultimately, exile. And at the heart of it all is a singular, damning phrase allegedly delivered behind closed doors by his own brother, King Charles III: "You don't belong here." This is not the kind of fairy tale the royal family ever wanted told, but it's the one they cannot suppress anymore. In the beginning, Prince Andrew was more than just a royal. He was a man of action. His early life was decorated with titles, service, and approval. As a helicopter pilot in the Falklands War, he was hailed as brave and dutiful, a contrast to the royal stereotype of aloof detachment. He was cheered, celebrated. Mothers pointed him out in magazines to their daughters. The Queen, it was said, favored him for his charisma, his ease with the public. He was the charming one, the relaxed one, the one who could handle the press. No one imagined then that the very press he once seduced would one day become his executioners. But charm has a short shelf life when it's not backed by discipline. And over time, Andrew began to walk the dangerous tightrope of royal entitlement. Privilege without accountability, lavish spending, questionable friendships, private jets, extravagant holidays. While his brother Charles bore the burden of monarchy and legacy, Andrew seemed to float just above the rules. Some called it freedom. Others whispered another word: arrogance. The first major dent came during his divorce from Sarah Ferguson. Though the marriage began with fanfare and youthful optimism, it dissolved in a blaze of public humiliation, toe-sucking photos, financial troubles, and accusations of indiscretion. While Charles managed the collapse of his marriage with Diana behind the iron veil of royal protocol, Andrew's unraveling played out more like a circus: chaotic, undignified, and uncontainable. But the palace weathered it. They always did. The monarchy, they believed, could absorb scandal, so long as it didn't touch the throne. Then came Epstein. The name alone carries weight, fear, and fury. Jeffrey Epstein, the disgraced financier whose death in a jail cell only deepened the public's appetite for answers, had a long and tangled history with the Duke of York. The extent of that relationship remains murky to this day. What we do know is that Andrew was photographed with him, traveled with him, stayed in his homes, appeared in public with him even after Epstein's first conviction, and most hauntingly, was photographed with a then 17-year-old Virginia Giuffre, who would later accuse him of sexual abuse, accusations Andrew vehemently denies to this day. In a moment meant to salvage what was left of his reputation, Prince Andrew agreed to sit for a televised interview with BBC's Newsnight in 2019. What happened next would change his life forever. In the interview, rather than express remorse or empathy, he deflected, minimized, and in one of the most widely mocked moments of the broadcast, claimed he could not have been with the young woman in question because he didn't sweat. The internet erupted. Memes replaced medals. The press declared it a disaster. Royal insiders were reportedly horrified. The Queen, loyal to a fault, is said to have offered him one last protective embrace. But King Charles and Prince William, reportedly furious over the damage to the crown's reputation, pushed back. The decision was swift and brutal. Andrew would step down from royal duties. His public appearances would cease. His military honors were revoked. He was a prince in name only. But even in exile, he had one thing left: Royal Lodge. The 30-room mansion nestled within Windsor Great Park had been his official residence for years. It was more than a home. It was a fortress of memories, the final remnant of a life once gilded in gold. Here, he entertained. Here, he held court. And most crucially, here, he believed, he would live until his final days. He had spent millions of his own money, some reportedly from the late Queen, to renovate and maintain it. In his mind, it was his. But power doesn't respect sentiment. Not in the House of Windsor. After Queen Elizabeth's death in 2022, the balance of influence shifted dramatically. King Charles III, now officially in charge of royal real estate and titles, began a campaign to slim down the monarchy. It was a strategy based on necessity and optics. Fewer working royals, fewer taxpayer burdens, less tolerance for scandal. And in that new vision, there was no room for a prince living in a multi-million-pound mansion who held no official duties and cast a long, dark shadow over the crown's public image. Insiders say Charles offered Andrew alternative accommodations: Frogmore Cottage, the former home of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. A move many saw as a not-so-subtle rebuke. From a sprawling estate to a relatively modest royal residence, Andrew reportedly refused. He would not budge. He would not be diminished further. But in the end, refusal meant nothing. The king had spoken. The eviction wasn't announced with a press release. It was a slow bleed, leaked in whispers and sourced statements. Furniture reportedly being removed. Security scaled back. Maintenance delayed. Staff quietly let go. And behind the closed doors of Royal Lodge, a man who once dined with presidents and kings now sat alone, wondering how it had all gone so catastrophically wrong. This story is not about guilt or innocence alone. It's about consequence. About what happens when a prince, who once walked beside the queen during royal processions, who saluted from palace balconies, who bore titles older than most nations, finds himself stripped of all protection. It's about a man who spent his life believing his birthright would shield him forever, until it didn't. There are no longer any royal engagements. No public tributes. No palace invites. He is, in every meaningful way, exiled. And for a man born into royalty, exile is not just a place, it's a condition, a permanent state of being. Every headline, every photograph, every exclusion is a reminder that he no longer belongs. But the story doesn't end there. Because behind palace walls, a battle still simmers, over money, reputation, and memory. Some say Andrew is threatening to fight back, to tell his side, to write a memoir that could explode what's left of the monarchy's fragile image. Others claim he's resigned to his fate, broken, clinging to dignity in private while the world forgets him. This video will take you behind the curtain, into the rooms where decisions were made, into the minds of those who shaped his fate. We will walk the timeline of his fall, hear the voices of those closest to the fire, and try to answer one final, searing question. When the gates of privilege finally close, who do they close hardest on? Because at the end of the day, this is not just a royal scandal. It is the anatomy of downfall. A once untouchable prince, cut off, cast out, and told the most brutal truth of all. You don't belong here. Before the world knew Prince Andrew as the disgraced royal at the center of one of the monarchy's most painful scandals, he was seen as the golden child of Queen Elizabeth II. Born on February 19, 1960, at Buckingham Palace, Andrew Albert Christian Edward arrived into a world vastly different from the one he would eventually depart from in shame. He was the third child and second son of Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, born nearly a decade after his elder siblings Charles and Anne. From the moment of his birth, his life was shaped not by choice or ambition, but by lineage, legacy, and the vast machinery of the British monarchy. At the time of his arrival, Andrew was second in line to the throne, a fact that carried enormous weight. He was not expected to be king, but he was expected to embody the crown's strength, honor, and stability. In the eyes of the monarchy and the public, he was the spare, a vital insurance policy should anything happen to the heir. But unlike Prince Charles, whose destiny was tightly scripted by tradition and duty, Andrew had room to roam. And roam he did. From the start, Andrew's upbringing diverged from the strict and often austere childhood experienced by his older siblings. Born during the height of Elizabeth's reign, Andrew benefited from the lessons learned in raising Charles and Anne. The Queen, now more comfortable in her dual role as sovereign and mother, was said to be more relaxed and affectionate with Andrew. Royal aides and insiders often commented on the unusually warm bond between Andrew and the Queen, describing him as her favorite. Prince Philip, too, reportedly had a soft spot for his younger son, appreciating his outgoing personality and masculine energy. Andrew's early childhood was spent in the lap of luxury, surrounded by nannies, tutors, and the kind of opulence few can comprehend. His playground was the sprawling grounds of royal estates, from Buckingham Palace to Balmoral, where he would ride horses, explore the woods, and absorb the grandeur of his ancestry. But even in these seemingly idyllic settings, the pressure of being royal was never far away. Every smile, every movement, every misstep was watched, recorded, judged. By the time Andrew entered Gordonstoun School in Scotland, an institution also attended by his father and elder brother, he was already well accustomed to the peculiar balance of privilege and isolation that defined royal life. Gordonstoun was no ordinary boarding school. Known for its harsh discipline, rigorous routines, and emphasis on resilience, it was designed to mold boys into men through hardship. For Charles, the experience had been borderline traumatic. For Andrew, it was different. He thrived. Not only did he enjoy the physical challenges, but he also excelled socially, quickly earning a reputation as confident, fun-loving, and popular. After Gordonstoun, Andrew enrolled in Britannia Royal Naval College at Dartmouth. It was here that he truly stepped into a more autonomous version of his royal identity. In the Navy, Andrew found purpose, discipline, and, perhaps most importantly, respect based on merit. He trained as a helicopter pilot and later served in the Falklands War in 1982, flying missions that supported ground troops and carried real risk. His involvement was not symbolic. He was in active service, praised for his bravery and commitment. For a brief moment, Andrew was not just the Queen's son, he was a war hero. The press adored him. The public saw him as relatable. He was the royal who had proven his mettle. This period in his life marked the pinnacle of Andrew's public image. Dashing, courageous, and seemingly grounded, he represented the modern royal man. Women swooned. Journalists followed his every move. He dated glamorous women, including American actress Koo Stark, and was often seen at parties and royal functions. Tabloids dubbed him Randy Andy, a nickname that he didn't seem to mind. If anything, he leaned into it, aware that the world found his charm disarming. While Charles bore the heavy expectations of kingship, Andrew enjoyed the freedom of royal status without the suffocating responsibility. His 1986 marriage to Sarah Ferguson, affectionately known as Fergie, was another moment of triumph. The wedding was a grand affair, broadcast globally, watched by over 500 million people. The couple appeared genuinely in love, laughing, joking, breaking royal stiffness with their contagious energy. The British public embraced them. Sarah, with her fiery red hair and outspoken nature, was a refreshing contrast to the more reserved Diana and other royal wives. Together, Andrew and Sarah represented something rare in the royal family: relatability. Their union produced two daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, who would become Andrew's most enduring legacy. As a father, he was reportedly attentive, playful, and deeply involved in his daughters' lives. To many within the palace and public, Andrew was not just fulfilling his royal duties. He was living the dream. He had honor, adventure, love, and a family. But beneath the surface, trouble was already brewing. Andrew's marriage to Sarah was far from perfect. Royal pressures, constant media scrutiny, and long periods apart due to Andrew's naval service created tension. Fergie's outspoken nature and occasional public missteps strained her relationship with the monarchy. And while the two maintained a united front for some time, the cracks began to show. In 1992, they officially separated, and soon after, Sarah was caught in a media storm involving intimate photos taken with a U.S. businessman. The scandal was explosive, humiliating not just for Sarah, but for Andrew, and by extension, the crown. Though their marriage ended in divorce, Andrew and Sarah maintained a surprisingly close friendship. They continued to cohabitate at Royal Lodge, raising eyebrows but insisting it was for the benefit of their daughters. Some saw it as a touching example of post-divorce maturity. Others suspected that Andrew, despite his charm, lacked direction without the structure of married life and military service. The dissolution of his career in the Royal Navy, he officially retired in 2001, left a void that he struggled to fill. From that point onward, Andrew's life was marked by a string of questionable decisions. He took on the role of the UK's Special Representative for International Trade and Investment, a position that granted him global access and influence. But rather than elevate his standing, it exposed him to shady dealings, controversial foreign connections, and allegations of conflict of interest. Trips to oil-rich nations, private jet travel funded by questionable sources, and lavish hospitality began to tarnish his image. The media narrative shifted. No longer the heroic prince or the endearing father, Andrew was increasingly portrayed as a freeloading royal, blind to public sentiment and out of touch with the realities of a post-recession Britain. Critics argued that he lived extravagantly while taxpayers bore the burden. Photos of him sunbathing in luxury resorts, attending lavish galas, and hosting questionable guests at royal residences began to erode the goodwill he had once enjoyed. Still, within the palace, Andrew was protected, if not respected. His relationship with the Queen remained strong. She defended him, offered him grace where others wouldn't, and allowed him to keep many of his privileges long after public opinion had turned. This favor created tension within the royal family. Charles, preparing to ascend the throne, was reportedly frustrated by his brother's refusal to modernize, to adapt, to show humility. The truth is, Andrew had spent his entire life in a bubble so insulated, so reverent of his own importance, that he could not imagine a world where he was held accountable. His upbringing, his education, his military honors, these were not just accolades, they were armor. And in his mind, they made him untouchable. But the walls of that belief were beginning to crack. The whispers were growing louder, the scandals more frequent, and the consequences more severe. This chapter in Andrew's life, his rise from cradle to commander, from war hero to world traveler, is essential to understanding his fall. Because only by seeing the full picture of what he once had can we comprehend the magnitude of what he would eventually lose. His privilege was not accidental. It was cultivated, protected, and, for a time, celebrated. But privilege without responsibility is a dangerous thing. It breeds arrogance. It blinds. And it often comes at the expense of others. If Prince Andrew's early life was a fairy tale woven with golden thread, then his marriage to Sarah Ferguson was the moment the script took a dramatic and irreversible turn. What began with romance, charm, and a public hungry for modern love quickly devolved into one of the most publicly scrutinized and embarrassing marital implosions in royal history. And yet, nestled deep within this collapse were the seeds of Andrew's eventual downfall, a pattern of entitlement, indulgence, and failure to recognize that even royalty is not immune to consequence. The year was 1985. Prince Andrew was 25 years old, fresh from his service in the Falklands War, and at the peak of his popularity. Known affectionately as Randy Andy by the British press, he was the royal playboy, the more approachable, flirtatious alternative to his stoic elder brother Charles. Women adored him. Tabloids followed his every move. There was pressure on him to settle down, but also an unspoken confidence that whoever he chose would be blessed with a life most people could only dream of. Then came Sarah Ferguson. She wasn't royal. She wasn't an aristocrat of supreme rank. But she was fiery, outgoing, and above all, different. A daughter of Major Ronald Ferguson, one of Prince Charles's polo managers, Sarah grew up with access to the royal circle but never belonged to it. She wasn't molded in the image of palace perfection. She laughed loudly, made sarcastic quips, and had a magnetic presence. For a family that often operated under the suffocating rules of formality, Sarah was an earthquake, and Andrew was immediately drawn to the tremor. Their courtship was swift, unconventional, and headline-grabbing. In contrast to Charles and Diana's cold, awkward dynamic, Andrew and Sarah were openly affectionate, often photographed holding hands, smiling, joking. To the media and the monarchy alike, They seemed to be exactly what the royal brand needed: young, in love, and human. The press dubbed them the fun couple. Royal watchers predicted that Sarah would inject much-needed life into an institution drifting under the weight of tradition and restraint. In July 1986, they were married in a glittering ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Millions watched around the world. Sarah wore a satin gown adorned with symbols of naval life, a nod to Andrew's military service. The Queen beamed with pride. Prince Philip, notoriously hard to please, appeared genuinely approving. The newly minted Duke and Duchess of York waved from the Buckingham Palace balcony as a roaring crowd erupted in celebration. For one brief moment, everything seemed perfect. But reality was far more complicated than the fairy tale photos suggested. From the outset, Andrew's naval career created strain. Just weeks after their wedding, he returned to sea for a 6-month tour. It was a shock to Sarah, who had naively assumed marriage to a prince would mean more time together. The truth was, Andrew's naval obligations meant he would be away for more than half their marriage. Sarah, left alone, was expected to adjust not only to a life of isolation, but to a role that came with relentless scrutiny. She struggled. Royal life demanded a quiet, composed, and obedient presence. But Sarah was none of those things. She was brash, impulsive, outspoken. She wore colors deemed too bold. She laughed too loudly. She made mistakes, and those mistakes were seized upon by a press that had grown weary of fawning coverage. Sarah quickly became a favorite target of British tabloids. They mocked her weight. They dissected her fashion. They gave her cruel nicknames like Duchess of Pork and Fergie the Frump. It was relentless. Behind closed doors, the marriage was deteriorating. Andrew's absences created emotional distance. And when he was present, sources later claimed, he was often irritable, aloof, or dismissive. The warmth they once shared had given way to tension and misunderstanding. Sarah felt unsupported. Andrew felt overwhelmed. And the pressure of maintaining appearances in front of the world only deepened their private disconnection. Their first daughter, Princess Beatrice, was born in 1988. Eugenie followed in 1990. For a short time, parenthood seemed to provide common ground, a shared purpose that revived the joy of their earlier years. But the reprieve was temporary. As the girls grew, so did the cracks in the marriage. Sarah, hungry for freedom and self-expression, began spending more time abroad, developing commercial ventures, and seeking identity beyond her title. Andrew, by contrast, remained anchored in the routines of royal life and the expectations of monarchy. Their paths, once aligned by passion, had diverged completely. In March 1992, they announced their separation. But what followed wasn't a quiet dissolution. It was a media-feeding frenzy that shattered whatever grace might have remained. That summer, photographs emerged that would haunt Sarah Ferguson for the rest of her life. Paparazzi captured intimate shots of her on holiday with her financial advisor, John Bryan, including a now infamous image of Bryan appearing to suck her toes while she lay topless on a sun lounger. The photographs were printed across the front pages of every major tabloid in Britain. The fallout was seismic. The Queen was reportedly mortified. Prince Philip was enraged. Even seasoned royal watchers were stunned. It wasn't just the content of the photos, it was the defiant, almost careless attitude they represented. For a woman still legally married to the Queen's son, the act was seen not just as a betrayal, it was an insult. Andrew, now publicly humiliated, was forced into a position he had never known before, the betrayed man. Though their separation had already been made official, the scandal fast-tracked the final collapse of their union. In 1996, they finalized their divorce. Sarah received a modest settlement, continued to live at Royal Lodge with Andrew's permission, and retained the Duchess of York title. But she was now fully outside the inner royal circle. Despite the scandal, Andrew maintained a surprisingly strong bond with Sarah. For years, they lived under the same roof, raised their daughters together, and frequently appeared at family functions side by side. Their relationship, though unconventional, was affectionate. To outsiders, it appeared that Andrew had forgiven her. To insiders, it confirmed a deeper truth. That Andrew struggled to set boundaries, and even in the wake of betrayal, preferred familiar chaos over solitude. But the fallout from the marriage and divorce extended far beyond personal pain. For the first time, Andrew was publicly mocked. The The press stopped treating him like a war hero or a royal bachelor and began questioning his judgment, his lifestyle, and his place in the royal hierarchy. The toe-sucking photos and his decision to continue cohabiting with Sarah painted him as a man adrift, unable or unwilling to adhere to the dignity expected of a royal duke. This period marked a crucial shift in Andrew's public identity. No longer was he the good-time prince. He was now something else, an oddity, a man aging ungracefully, clinging to past glories, drifting further from public sympathy. His continued presence at royal events, often alongside Sarah, led to confusion and ridicule. The lines between royal responsibility and personal indulgence were blurred, and the crown, increasingly sensitive to public opinion, began to distance itself. Yet, through it all, Andrew remained defiant. He believed that his service record, his loyalty to the Queen, and his years of public appearances were enough to shield him from scrutiny. He was still, after all, the Queen's son, and the Queen, though often advised to push him further into the shadows, maintained a mother's protective hand. She invited him to Balmoral. She ensured he had access to royal residences. She allowed him to remain within the safety of royal infrastructure. But this indulgence came at a cost. It allowed Andrew to believe that his status was invincible, that no matter what choices he made, no matter how out of step with public morality he fell, he would always be protected. That belief, nurtured during his marriage, solidified during his divorce, and encouraged by the Queen's enduring support, would set the stage for his greatest miscalculation yet. In the years that followed, Andrew's behavior did not become more cautious. Instead, it became bolder. He accepted lavish gifts from questionable foreign regimes. He fraternized with oligarchs, tycoons, and controversial figures. He took private jets, stayed in multi-million-dollar villas, and gave the impression that he operated on a different plane than the rest of his family. And as long as he remained technically scandal-free, no one intervened. But the world was changing. Royal expectations were shifting. Charles, long waiting in the wings, was preparing for a monarchy that could no longer afford to carry dead weight. William and Kate were ushering in a new era of family-focused, relatable royalty. Harry, though controversial in his own right, was gaining attention for his authenticity and passion for causes. And Andrew, still lounging in luxury, still posing for photos, still denying any need for change, was looking increasingly like a relic. His marriage had been the first wake-up call. His divorce, the first public reckoning. But neither changed him. If anything, they reinforced his sense of exceptionalism. He had survived scandal before. He had been ridiculed, shamed, and yet never removed. Why would anything be different now? That question would find its devastating answer in the chapters to come. In the landscape of Prince Andrew's increasingly controversial life, no relationship would come to define his public downfall more catastrophically than his association with Jeffrey Epstein. This was not simply a matter of poor judgment or guilt by association. This was a connection so toxic, so publicly damning, that it would ultimately strip Andrew of his royal roles, isolate him from his family, and reduce his global image to that of a disgraced figure clinging to shreds of former privilege. To understand the weight of what happened, we must trace how this friendship began, why it was allowed to flourish, and how it detonated in public view, taking down a prince with it. The seeds of this alliance were planted in the early 2000s, a time when Andrew, already divorced and semi-detached from any consistent royal duty, was attempting to reinvent himself. He had taken on the role of the United Kingdom's special representative for international trade and investment, a position that afforded him access to elite global circles. He was no longer a full-time naval officer or a traditional working royal, but he was still traveling frequently, rubbing shoulders with business magnates, politicians, and billionaires. It was during this time, in these corridors of wealth and influence, that he crossed paths with Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein was a financier with murky credentials, but an undeniable knack for positioning himself among the world's elite. His townhouse in Manhattan was said to be one of the most valuable private homes in the city. His private Caribbean island was a hotspot for celebrities and politicians. He surrounded himself with people who mattered, scientists, Hollywood stars, royalty, and used this network as both a shield and a currency. He was enigmatic, manipulative, and ultimately monstrous. But for men like Andrew, he was also useful. The exact details of how Andrew and Epstein met remain unclear, but many reports indicate that their mutual connection was Ghislaine Maxwell, the daughter of disgraced media tycoon Robert Maxwell, and a prominent figure in elite social circles. Ghislaine and Andrew had been friends for years, often seen together at charity events and private dinners. She was polished, connected, and seemingly harmless. It was through her that Epstein gained access to Andrew, and vice versa. By the early 2000s, Andrew was making multiple trips to New York. His role as trade envoy gave him plausible reasons to be seen with powerful men like Epstein. There were dinners, photo ops, and meetings. But behind the scenes, their friendship went beyond formal functions. Andrew reportedly stayed at Epstein's properties, including the now notorious Manhattan Mansion, a location where Epstein's crimes against young girls would later be uncovered in harrowing detail. Photographs began to surface. Andrew walking in Central Park with Epstein, the two laughing, deep in conversation. The optics alone were enough to raise eyebrows. After all, Epstein had already been accused of sex crimes involving minors by that point. Yet Andrew appeared unconcerned. Whether through arrogance, ignorance, or a belief in invincibility, he maintained the friendship even as Epstein's legal troubles deepened. It's important to pause here and consider the world in which Andrew lived. He had been a royal all his life. Consequences had always been theoretical. Every scandal, every criticism, had eventually faded, erased by the next ribbon-cutting or military parade. For Andrew, being seen with Epstein was not a risk. It was part of the social game. He viewed himself as untouchable, and that belief would cost him everything. In 2008, Epstein was convicted in Florida on charges of procuring a minor for prostitution. He served a notoriously lenient sentence that many now view as a gross miscarriage of justice. Most high-profile individuals fled from him during this period, severing ties and issuing public statements of disapproval. But not Andrew. In fact, after Epstein was released from jail, Andrew visited him in New York. This visit, in 2010, would become the subject of relentless criticism in the years to follow. What was he thinking? Why would a senior royal associate himself with a convicted sex offender, particularly one accused of crimes involving underage girls? Andrew later claimed he visited Epstein in person to end their friendship. A closure conversation of sorts. But the media and public didn't buy it. Photographers captured the two men walking through Central Park together, casually strolling as if nothing had changed. In one image, they appear to be deep in thought. In another, Andrew waves from the door of Epstein's Manhattan mansion, seemingly at ease, completely unaware that these frames would haunt him forever. Then came the most damning image of all. A photo, circulated across tabloids and major news networks, emerged showing Prince Andrew with his arm around the waist of a teenage girl. She was later identified as Virginia Roberts Giuffre, a young woman who would accuse Epstein, and by extension, Andrew, of horrific abuse. In the photo, she smiles nervously. Andrew appears relaxed. Behind them, Ghislaine Maxwell grins at the camera, her presence confirming the legitimacy of the scene. Virginia Giuffre later alleged that she was forced to have sex with Prince Andrew on 3 occasions. Once in London, once in New York, and once on Epstein's private island. She claimed she was 17 at the time. Andrew has categorically denied these allegations, insisting that he has no recollection of ever meeting her. But the photo told a different story. When the accusations first emerged, the palace went into defense mode. Statements were released. Lawyers were consulted. But the strategy was clear: deny, deflect, and hope the storm passed. After all, Andrew was a royal. He was shielded by protocol, tradition, and an aging monarch who still held enormous public support. But the tide was shifting. The rise of the #MeToo movement changed everything. Suddenly, accusations of sexual abuse and exploitation were being taken seriously in a way they hadn't before. Survivors were speaking out. Powerful men were being brought down. The public, once indifferent or skeptical, was now demanding accountability. And within this new cultural climate, Andrew's association with Epstein went from distasteful to damning. Under growing pressure, Andrew agreed to do the unthinkable, a televised interview. The BBC's Newsnight program, hosted by journalist Emily Maitlis, secured the exclusive. The goal, from Andrew's perspective, was to clear his name. But from the very beginning, The interview was a disaster. He appeared evasive, out of touch, and at times astonishingly tone-deaf. He said he had no recollection of ever meeting Virginia Giuffre, despite the photo. He claimed he was at a Pizza Express in Woking on the night of one alleged encounter. He said he was medically incapable of sweating, a bizarre detail meant to disprove one of Giuffre's claims. But instead of sounding credible, he came off as absurd. The British public, and indeed the global audience, watched in disbelief. Memes exploded online. Analysts, journalists, and legal experts tore the interview apart. Even palace insiders admitted, off the record, that it had been a catastrophic miscalculation. What was meant to be a moment of redemption became the final nail in the coffin. The fallout was swift. Within days, Prince Andrew stepped back from public duties. His patronages, once numbering over 200, were suspended. Charities severed ties. Universities and institutions removed his name from their buildings. He became a pariah almost overnight. And yet, the consequences kept coming. Virginia Giuffre filed a civil lawsuit in the United States, seeking damages for the alleged abuse. For months, legal teams on both sides maneuvered, negotiated, and prepared for a possible trial. Andrew, through his lawyers, continued to deny all wrongdoing. But the damage to his reputation was irreversible. The Queen, under immense pressure, finally took action. In January 2022, Buckingham Palace announced that Prince Andrew would be stripped of his military titles and royal patronages. He would no longer use His Royal Highness in any official capacity. He was, for all intents and purposes, removed from royal life. That same month, the palace released a carefully worded statement. It read, "With the Queen's approval and agreement, the Duke of York's military affiliations and royal patronages have been returned to the Queen." The language was clinical, but the message was clear. The royal family had drawn a line. Andrew was no longer one of them in any meaningful way. In February 2022, just weeks before his scheduled deposition, Andrew reached a financial settlement with Virginia Giuffre. Reports suggested the amount was in the millions, allegedly funded in part by the Queen herself. The settlement included no admission of guilt, but the optics were impossible to spin. A senior royal had paid millions to avoid a public trial for allegations of sexual abuse. The monarchy was reeling. This was the moment Andrew's world truly began to collapse. His friendship with Epstein, once a footnote in his glittering biography, had become the defining chapter of his life. It was no longer possible to discuss Prince Andrew without referencing the scandal. It followed him everywhere, in headlines, in whispers, in public disgust. The man who once flew rescue missions in the Falklands, who danced in palaces and dined with dignitaries, was now a cautionary tale. And perhaps most painful of all was the knowledge that he had brought it upon himself. He had chosen to ignore warnings. He had dismissed criticism. He had believed that his title, his name, and his mother's protection would insulate him forever. But nothing insulates against truth. And nothing, not even bloodline, can protect against betrayal, not of others, but of one's own values. Every public figure has a moment, often unplanned, sometimes entirely self-inflicted, when the illusion shatters. For Prince Andrew, that moment came on November 16, 2019, when he sat down for what would become one of the most disastrous television interviews in modern British royal history. Broadcast by the BBC's Newsnight and helmed by journalist Emily Maitlis, the interview was meant to be a chance for Andrew to clear the air, provide clarity regarding his now infamous association with Jeffrey Epstein, and, ideally, reclaim his standing in the court of public opinion. Instead, it achieved the exact opposite. It's not often that a single media appearance leads to the downfall of a royal. But this interview was different. It wasn't the result of aggressive questioning or media manipulation. It was something far more damaging, Prince Andrew's own words. His tone, demeanor, and bizarre justifications during the interview painted a portrait of a man entirely removed from the gravity of his circumstances. This wasn't just a public relations disaster. It was the unmasking of a prince who appeared shockingly unaware of how far he had already fallen. In the days leading up to the interview, there had been mounting speculation about Andrew's legal exposure in the Epstein scandal. Virginia Giuffre's allegations were gaining international attention. The photograph of Andrew with his arm around her waist, taken inside Ghislaine Maxwell's London townhouse when she was just 17, had become iconic, not because it was celebratory, but because it represented a looming question no one could ignore. What exactly was Prince Andrew doing in Epstein's orbit? And what was his relationship to the young women at the center of this dark and widening scandal? The palace, under increasing pressure, needed a strategy. Behind closed doors, Andrew was reportedly confident. In his mind, he had done nothing wrong. He believed his association with Epstein, while unfortunate, had been mischaracterized. He saw the interview not as a gamble, but as a remedy. Trusted advisors cautioned against it. Public relations experts warned of the risks. But Andrew persisted. He believed he could explain himself. And in that belief lay the fatal flaw. Emily Maitlis, a seasoned interviewer with a sharp intellect and an unflinching gaze, was the perfect counterweight to Andrew's misplaced confidence. From the first moments of the broadcast, viewers could sense the dissonance between the seriousness of the subject matter and the prince's demeanor. Dressed in a suit and seated in the elegant surroundings of Buckingham Palace's blue drawing room, Andrew began what would become a train wreck in slow motion. The questions were pointed, but fair. Maitlis asked about his friendship with Epstein, how it began, why it continued, and most importantly, why he had visited Epstein in New York in 2010, 2 years after Epstein had been convicted of soliciting a minor. Andrew's response was delivered with casual ease. He admitted the visit had occurred, but insisted it was to end the friendship. He claimed it was the honorable thing to do, to see Epstein in person and sever ties directly. That statement alone raised eyebrows. Why would a member of the British royal family choose to personally visit a convicted sex offender, especially in his own home, surrounded by controversy, when he could have simply written a letter or made a phone call? The explanation was not only weak, it was puzzling. It spoke to a detachment from public sentiment, a lack of understanding about the optics of his actions. But it was the subsequent questions that truly cemented the interview as catastrophic. When asked about the infamous photo with Virginia Giuffre, Andrew claimed he had no recollection of ever meeting her. He did not deny that the photo was real, but suggested that he had no memory of the event. It was an odd defense, an evasive posture that failed to offer clarity or credibility. Maitlis pressed him on the specifics of Giuffre's allegations, which included claims that they had danced at a London nightclub and that he had been sweating profusely during the encounter. Andrew's response will likely be remembered as one of the most bizarre lines ever uttered in a royal interview. "I have a peculiar medical condition," he said, "which is that I don't sweat, or I didn't sweat at the time." He went on to explain that this condition had resulted from an adrenaline overdose during his time in the Falklands War. The moment was surreal. Viewers across the globe watched in disbelief as a British royal tried to disprove a sexual abuse allegation by claiming he was medically incapable of sweating. Social media erupted instantly. Memes flooded Twitter and Instagram. The phrase, "I don't sweat," trended worldwide. It was, for lack of a better word, a public relations nightmare. And yet, the interview continued, each answer more damning than the last. When asked if he regretted his friendship with Epstein, Andrew replied, "No." He quickly attempted to clarify, saying that the opportunities and connections he gained through Epstein had been useful, but the damage was done. Here was a man accused of associating with a sex trafficker and pedophile, a man accused of being complicit or at least indifferent to the suffering of dozens of young girls. And yet he couldn't bring himself to say the words the public so desperately needed to hear. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. I regret it." The tone of the interview was not one of humility or contrition. It was one of detachment, defensiveness, and misplaced confidence. Andrew spoke as though he believed he was still protected by royal privilege, as though the world owed him understanding, as though the truth could be rewritten simply by his insistence. But the world had changed. In the wake of the #MeToo movement, victims were finally being heard. Power was no longer a shield. And the British public, increasingly skeptical of royal opulence and detached aristocracy, were in no mood to extend grace to a prince who appeared incapable of accountability. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Media outlets across the UK and abroad labeled the interview a disaster. The Times called it a car crash. The Guardian described it as a rare and perplexing moment of royal misjudgment. BBC colleagues themselves were stunned by what they had witnessed. Palace insiders, speaking anonymously to journalists, admitted that the fallout had exceeded their worst fears. Within days, the repercussions began to unfold. Organizations that had long been associated with Prince Andrew began to sever ties. University chancellorships, charity patronages, business partnerships, one by one, they announced that they would no longer be affiliated with him. A total of over 200 organizations distanced themselves from the Duke of York. It was not merely reputational damage, it was a full-scale rejection. But it was what happened within the palace that truly marked the magnitude of the moment. Just 4 days after the interview aired, Buckingham Palace released a statement. It read, "With the Queen's approval and agreement, the Duke of York is stepping back from public duties for the foreseeable future." The language was carefully chosen, but the meaning was unmistakable. Prince Andrew, once the Queen's favored son, was being pushed aside. And it didn't stop there. In January 2022, after a U.S. judge ruled that the civil lawsuit brought by Virginia Giuffre could proceed, the palace took further action. A new statement announced that Andrew's military titles and royal patronages had been returned to the Queen. Furthermore, he would no longer use the title His Royal Highness in any official capacity. These were not symbolic gestures, they were devastating blows. The Duke of York was being erased from royal life. He would no longer represent the monarchy. His name would not appear on royal event rosters. His presence would be omitted from ceremonial functions. He was, for all intents and purposes, exiled. And it all began with an interview. There's a strange irony to the entire saga. In his attempt to clear his name, Andrew had instead provided the most compelling evidence of his own culpability, not in the legal sense, but in the court of public opinion. He had shown the world that he did not understand the gravity of his actions, that he could not express genuine remorse, and that he was out of step with the moral compass of the society he once claimed to serve. For many, the interview revealed a deeper truth, that Prince Andrew had been living in a bubble of privilege and denial for decades. That he believed, sincerely, that his title and status would always protect him. That he thought a well-dressed television appearance could rewrite reality. But reality had changed. And once the public saw the truth, not just in what he said, but in how he said it, there was no going back. In the wake of the BBC interview's catastrophic fallout, the British monarchy faced a reckoning unlike any in its modern history. For centuries, the Crown had navigated scandals and personal tragedies with a mixture of discretion, control, and carefully managed distance. Yet in late 2019 and early 2020, Prince Andrew's association with Jeffrey Epstein and the prince's disastrous public defense forced the institution to confront a question it had long avoided. What happens when a senior royal becomes a pariah, and the usual mechanisms of damage control no longer suffice? At first, the palace attempted the familiar playbook. Courtiers penned statements emphasizing Andrew's decades of public service, his contributions to charity, and his loyalty to the Queen. They framed his step back from duties as a temporary measure, a chance for introspection, a period of privacy to address personal matters. But behind the polished words lay a deeper unease. Andrew's continued presence, even as an inactive royal, tarnished the image of a monarchy striving for renewal under King Charles. It threatened to become a permanent distraction, undermining the Crown's efforts to present a streamlined, modern identity to a skeptical public. By January 2022, pressure had reached a breaking point. A U.S. federal judge had ruled that Virginia Giuffre's lawsuit alleging sexual abuse by Andrew could proceed. Now, the question was no longer theoretical. It was legal and potentially explosive. The prospect of a public trial loomed, a televised spectacle that could drag the private griefs and allegations of victims into the glaring spotlight of global media. In response, Buckingham Palace took its most drastic action yet. On January 13, 2022, it issued a statement that sent shockwaves through royal circles. With the Queen's approval, all of Prince Andrew's military affiliations and royal patronages were to be returned to her. The language was deliberate and clinical, no flourish, no hint of sympathy. The decision was final. The announcements read like an itemized list of everything Andrew had once held dear. Colonel of the Grenadier Guards, Honorary Commodore of the Royal Naval Reserve, Vice Admiral of the United Kingdom, Knight Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order, Royal Knight of the Most Noble Order of the Garter, and dozens more honorary titles and positions. In addition to military roles, Andrew's patronages of charitable organizations vanished in a matter of hours. He had served as patron for institutions ranging from children's hospices to maritime heritage groups. Each organization issued its own brief statement, expressing regret but emphasizing they would now operate under the Crown's direct purview or find a new patron. Overnight, Andrew's name was excised from websites, letterheads, and charity dinners. His photograph was replaced or removed, his presence erased. For the public, these moves signaled a radical shift. They demonstrated that even royals, even sons of the monarch, were not above the rules. They underscored a new era of accountability, one in which reputation and responsibility mattered more than bloodline. But for Andrew personally, the impact was devastating. Titles in the British monarchy are not mere decorations. They are symbols of duty, honor, and belonging. A military title implies service and leadership. A patronage implies a bond of trust between the royal and the public. Being stripped of such roles is akin to a soldier discarding his uniform. Without it, the identity dissolves. Inside palace walls, reactions were mixed. Some senior courtiers believed the decision was necessary, applauding Charles's resolve. They saw it as a painful but essential step in preserving the institution's integrity. Others worried about precedent. If the monarchy could so decisively remove one of its own, could it not be used similarly against others? They fretted about the stability of royal privilege and the potential for public opinion to dictate internal family dynamics. Meanwhile, Andrew retreated into an ever-shrinking world. Without official duties, he had few reasons to leave Royal Lodge. His days of traveling to international trade fairs, attending gala dinners, and cutting ribbons at charity openings were over. He meandered through corridors once bustling with activity, met with a skeleton staff of loyal aides, and confronted a reality he had long refused to acknowledge, that the Crown no longer considered him a working member of the family. He attempted to maintain a semblance of normalcy. He arranged small private gatherings at Royal Lodge for old friends. He continued to use his car and security detail. He spoke of returning to his duties in time, but public invitations never arrived. Invitations to Trooping the Color, Remembrance Sunday, Easter services, rituals that had marked his life since birth, stopped coming. Each absence was a silent rebuke. Outside the palace, the British tabloids reveled in the spectacle. Front-page headlines screamed about Prince Andrew's shame and the lost Duke. Cartoons depicted him in prison stripes or locked behind iron gates. Columnists speculated about his mental and financial state, suggesting he was living off a secret trust fund or surviving on loans from his ex-wife's inheritance. Even charitable organizations he once supported spoke of the relief he was no longer involved, describing the public reaction to his patronage as a liability. Despite it all, Andrew publicly maintained a defiant posture. In a rare interview following the removal of his titles, he spoke of his love for the Queen, his regret over the stain on the family name, but also his belief that the public would eventually see his side of the story. He hinted at future projects, foundation work, business ventures, lectures on entrepreneurship, but these never materialized. Invitations to speak at conferences went unanswered. Companies declined his overtures for paid appearances, wary of the reputational risk. The financial aspect of his fall was significant as well. No longer a working royal, Andrew lost the diplomatic immunity that provided certain tax benefits and financial protections. While he had personal wealth, inheritance from his mother, investments, and the late Queen's occasional support, he now faced substantial legal bills from the Joffrey lawsuit, as well as the costs of maintaining Royal Lodge. Rumors swirled that he considered selling personal possessions, even artworks and gifts received during official tours. The idea of Andrew auctioning off royal memorabilia, something unimaginable just a few years prior, became a whispered possibility. Amid this tangible erosion of status and fortune, the psychological toll became evident. Andrew, once accustomed to adulation, now experienced the sting of rejection at every turn. His name became shorthand for scandal. Friends distanced themselves. The charities he had championed moved on. He found himself forced into self-reflection, something he had never prioritized during decades of privilege. By mid-2022, palace watchers noted a significant change in Andrew's appearance and demeanor. His hair had thinned further. His shoulders were slumped. The medical condition that once afforded him bizarre defenses in public, his unwillingness to sweat, now seemed a metaphor for his emotional state. A man so deprived of warmth, so cut off from genuine human connection, that he was left cold. No longer could he rely on the comfort of routine royal duties. No longer could he bask in ceremonial pageantry. He had been stripped bare, titles lost, patronages revoked, privileges rescinded. The man who once embodied the promise of the modern monarchy was now reduced to a cautionary figure, a study in how entitlement and denial can precipitate ruin. Yet, even in this abyss, Andrew sought ways to assert agency. He reportedly explored legal challenges to regain certain privileges, though these efforts never gained traction. He attempted outreach to charities to negotiate honorary roles, but was rebuffed. He mused about relocating abroad to start afresh, potentially in the United States or the Middle East, where his name might carry less weight. But without resources or support, these plans remained speculative. The palace, conscious of the public's enduring fascination with Andrew, took further steps to cement his exile. In late 2022, during the Queen's annual birthday parade, known as Trooping the Color, Andrew's absence was conspicuous. Photographers noted empty chairs in the royal box. Journalists wrote obituaries of his career long before his death. Commentators debated whether he would ever set foot on palace grounds again. And yet, the human heart is a complex thing. Wounded and humiliated, Andrew still longed for acceptance. He still craved the warmth of his siblings' company and the embrace of the institution that had nurtured him since birth. But the wounds he had inflicted on the monarchy's reputation ran too deep. The Queen, by then gravely ill, reportedly refused to see him. Charles and William remained distant. Duty compelled them to enforce the decision. In the rigid hierarchy of royalty, brotherly forgiveness was subordinate to institutional necessity. By the time the world rang in 2023, Prince Andrew's world had been whittled down to a handful of aides, the expansive but now quiet royal lodge, and the memories of a life that once brimmed with purpose and prestige. The titles he once carried like badges of honor now lingered only in history books and archive footage. The privileges he often took for granted were gone. He was, in a sense, unmoored, adrift in the currents of his own making. But while his public life lay in ruins, questions remained about his private life. How did he fill his days? Who, if anyone, offered him companionship? Sources suggested he spent hours walking in the grounds of Windsor Great Park, sometimes stopping to stare at the palace gates, as if willing them to open. Others said he threw himself into small charitable efforts away from the spotlight, feeding programs for local communities or private fundraising for cancer research, but never sought recognition. Some even claimed he found solace in traditional prayer and quiet reflection, returning to the faith that had guided his childhood. These glimpses into Andrew's personal adjustments hinted at a man grappling with the consequences of his actions. Titles lost and patronages revoked are more than symbolic. They are markers of identity, of connection with society, of purpose. When they vanish, a void opens, a void Andrew was now forced to confront without the shield of privilege. This chapter in Andrew's story reveals a stark truth. In the modern era, even royalty is subject to the same forces that govern every public figure: public opinion, accountability, and legal process. The monarchy's long history of managing scandal through quiet retirements and unspoken agreements no longer sufficed. The people demanded transparency. The media demanded accountability. And the institution, seeking to preserve its core, made the painful choice to strip Andrew of everything that tied him to its legacy. In losing his titles and patronages, Prince Andrew lost more than honors. He lost his place in history as a working member of the crown. He lost the ability to serve, to lead, to contribute. He lost the validation that comes from duty recognized and appreciated. Stripped bare, he stood exposed, no longer a prince, but a man forced to reckon with the reality that privilege never guarantees protection. Royal Lodge had always been more than a residence. It was a symbol of Prince Andrew's place within the royal ecosystem. Nestled within Windsor Great Park, the sprawling 30-room mansion and its manicured grounds represented both family heritage and personal sanctuary. It was there that Andrew had raised his daughters, entertained heads of state, and enjoyed the last vestiges of an active royal life. And it was there, during the crisis that would dismantle his world, that the first true battle for his future was fought, not in courtrooms, but in private corridors lined with portraits of the Windsor dynasty. The crisis began quietly, almost imperceptibly. In the aftermath of the BBC interview and the subsequent stripping of titles and patronages, the palace's focus shifted toward the practical realities of Andrew's status. He was no longer a working royal drawing an official stipend. He no longer held military roles that justified the cost of maintaining his security detail, his staff, or the upkeep of his residence. Questions arose. Who would pay for Royal Lodge now? Who would ensure the gardens were pruned, the heating maintained, and the household staff paid? In a normal royal context, these concerns would have been managed discreetly. Funding for senior royals comes from a combination of sovereign grant, private income, and public allocations. But for Andrew, the public appetite for spending on a disgraced prince had evaporated. Media scrutiny turned not only to his behavior, but to the question of whether taxpayer money should continue to subsidize his lifestyle. Opinion polls found a majority of Britons opposing continued public funding. Tabloids ran exposés on the cost of his security detail, the electricity bills of the mansion, and the salaries of housekeepers paid to dust the halls of someone now effectively persona non grata. Behind the scenes, King Charles's advisors convened. The message was clear. The monarchy could not afford the politi. A decision was made, one that would send a clear signal. Andrew would be expected to relinquish Royal Lodge and find alternative accommodation. No eviction notice would be issued publicly. Instead, leaks would be strategically placed to allow the narrative to develop in the press, making it appear as though Andrew himself had refused the Crown's offer of relocation. The palace publicly offered Andrew Frogmore Cottage, an estate less grand, but still a royal property, once home to Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Frogmore was modest by comparison, 6 bedrooms, a smaller staff, and a fraction of Royal Lodge's footprint. The public construed the offer as magnanimous, a gesture of brotherly courtesy from Charles. But the subtext was clear to those in the know: move quietly, accept the compromise, and retain royal support. Refuse, and the palace would quietly withdraw security, support, and funding. Andrew's reaction was immediate and defiant. Sources close to him described feelings of betrayal. He had expected loyalty from his brother, not ultimatums. To Andrew, Royal Lodge was not just a house. It was a repository of his identity. It was the site of his daughter's birthdays, of family celebrations, of countless dinners and receptions. To give it up was to acknowledge his fall was final, irreversible. And so he balked. Negotiations began in earnest. Senior courtiers, reluctant to confront Andrew directly, sent intermediaries, trusted aides from the Queen's household, to discuss options. They emphasized the practicalities, the cost, the optics, the inevitability. They appealed to his sense of family duty.